Today's webinar is using the ADDIE method to create library training sessions. It's presented by Lauren Hayes. Lauren is the Instructional and Research Librarian at Mid-America Nazarene University and in Olathe, Kansas. In May of 2018, she graduated with a doctoral degree, and she is co-editing a book on the scholarship of teaching and learning for academic librarians. She is passionate about teaching and learning and desires to help librarians develop in their instructor-facilitator skills. More specifically, her professional interests include teaching, SOTL, information literacy, educational technology, library and information science education, teacher identity, and faculty development. On a personal note, she loves dogs, traveling, and home, and I learned this morning she loves avocado toast. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. Yes, I do love avocado toast, though I am not a millennial. We were having a discussion about that earlier. So thank you so much for having me today. I am excited to share information about the ADDIE model. So the ADDIE model is a framework that's used in the field of instructional design to guide the creation of teaching sessions and then just a variety of instruction. The framework is comprised of 5 core components, which we'll talk about again in more detail, but just to kind of introduce it now, those 5 core components are analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And so ADDIE is an acronym. Each of the 5 components are a different stage of the design process that helps guide development. And so today we're going to be learning about the ADDIE model and then look at some specific ways to apply it in library training sessions. And so just to recap the goals for today, I hope that by the end of this session you'll be able to identify the steps in the ADDIE instructional design model, describe the different parts of the ADDIE model, and then be able to apply the ADDIE model to create a library training session. If you have any questions as we move throughout the content today, please do not hesitate to type it in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that throughout our time together today and try to answer any questions as they come up. But then I've also built in some time at the end of the session today for questions as well. But don't feel like you need to hold your questions until the end, because I'm a big believer that we want to ask questions as we have them, because other people might be thinking the same thing and we can learn a lot from each other. So what exactly is ADDIE? So according to the website instructionaldesign.org, which is a great site for information on instructional design if you're looking for one, the ADDIE model is the generic process traditionally used by instructional designers and training developers. The 5 phases, analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation, represent a dynamic, flexible guideline for building effective training and performance support tools. So for a little history about ADDIE, the concept of instructional design can be traced back to as early as the 1950s, but that ADDIE was designed in 1975. So according to the site educationaltechnology.net, ADDIE was originally developed for the U.S. Army by the Center for Educational Technology at Florida State University. ADDIE was later implemented across all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. The ADDIE model was based on an earlier instructional design model, the 5-step approach, which had been developed by the U.S. Air Force. The ADDIE model retained this 5-step feature and included many sub-stages within each of the 5 broad phases. Due to the hierarchical nature of the steps, one had to complete the process in a linear fashion, completing one phase before starting the next. Practitioners over the years have made several revisions in the stages of the original hierarchical version, and this has made the model more interactive and dynamic. And it was in the mid-1980s that the version similar to the current version appeared. Today, the influence of the ADDIE method can be seen on most instructional design models being used. So instructional design is a kind of a field where many individuals create different types of training. And so often it has been used in the armed forces or in corporate America, but there's a lot of instructional design that's getting included in institutions of higher education, especially in online learning. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn in libraries to be able to take from those experiences and apply to what we do. So why use ADDIE? So this model is used extensively by instructional designers, which you heard about a little bit with the history there, and other educators to design instruction. In fact, many other instructional design models are just variations of the ADDIE model. So I think that's a really good reason to use it. Since it is the most common design model, it's always a good place to start. So often, librarians are asked to create training sessions without any guidance or background in education. Therefore, ADDIE is a model that can be used to help librarians design training. So as I mentioned and will unpack in the upcoming slides, ADDIE stands for Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. Educators, instructional designers, and training developers find this approach very useful because having stages clearly defined facilitates implementation of effective training tools. Okay, so the first stage is the analysis stage, or it could be known as analyze. So I'm going to walk through each of the stages, but please note, and I'll come back to this later, that the ADDIE sequence does not have to be a strict linear progression through the steps. You can always start at any point in the process, and I'll give some examples of that coming up. But that being said, let's start with the analysis stage and then just walk through them as they're listed within ADDIE. So the analysis stage can also be called the goal setting stage. So in the analysis phase, the instructional problem kind of is clarified, the instructional goals and objectives are established, and the learning environment and learners' existing knowledge and skills are identified. And so here are some questions that can be addressed during the analysis stage. And these questions can be found from the site that I mentioned earlier, instructionaldesign.org. I'm looking specifically at the ADDIE model. So if you want to go back and find these later, you can go to that site. So one question is, who is the audience and their characteristics? It's often very helpful to know about your audience as much as you can. Really think about who it is that you're going to be designing training for so that you can tailor your instruction to them. Are there new behavioral outcomes that you're trying to meet? Because you need to know who that audience is and then what you're trying to help them learn. What types of learning constraints exist? So think about, are there things that you need to be aware of in terms of maybe space constraints? Are there only so many computers in the room? Are you limited to a certain projection feature? Maybe you're working with a group of individuals that English is their second language, and so you'll definitely want to think about needing handouts or presentation material in multiple languages. So being aware of those things up front can really help with the learning process. What are the delivery options? Are you thinking about doing face-to-face training? Are you wanting to create some training on library tools that can be delivered online, maybe some video tutorials that will help library users use some of the software or navigate the website? Are you thinking about having one-on-one interactions, or are you planning to create training for a whole group? Think through what those delivery options will look like. Think about online pedagogical considerations. And what I mean by this is if you're creating video tutorials make sure that you are, getting the closed captions in there. Maybe you're thinking about creating not just video tutorials, maybe you're also thinking about maybe some tutorials that include questions. And so there's a video that they watch, they answer some questions. There's more videos, some more things that they need to do. Just think through all the different types of tools and pedagogical things that you can do online. And then, what is the timeline for project completion? This is really important, and sometimes we do it well because as librarians, I think we're typically pretty good project managers. But often creating training, especially when you're creating any sort of online training, can take a lot longer than maybe we realize or anticipate. And so just being aware of that timeline and what the goals are for completion are really important. And so when you can answer some of these questions up front, it can really help you to create more effective instruction and learning opportunities. And then, as I mentioned, that website, you can see these questions from instructionaldesign.org. Okay. Actually, I'm going to go back a slide, sorry. So I want to talk a little bit more about the analysis phase. I won't belabor this too much, but just to make sure that we all are on the same page about this. The analysis phase looks at a lot of different things. As you can see here, there's a few more that I want to just mention from the site educationaltechnology.net that might help kind of flesh these questions out a bit more. So as you're thinking about the audience and their characteristics, you might also want to think about the typical background of the library users who will participate in the program. To the extent that you can know, think about age, because that might not necessarily, not trying to say that experience and age are always kind of correlated, but sometimes you can just get a sense, if you know you're going to be working with a particular audience of a certain age group, what experiences they might bring to the table. And to the extent that you can, think about previous experiences and interests. Also think about, of course, goals, what needs to be accomplished at the end. Think about what will be required in terms of skills, maybe some actions that need to be taken. Think about popular methods that are being used around the subject or the content that you're trying to teach. Also think about various options that could be available with respect to the learning environment. And so we mentioned the different delivery options. What you'll also want to ask yourself is, what delivery option is going to be the most conducive for the type of learning that you're wanting to do? Is it a combination of live face-to-face big group sessions and one-on-one? Or is it that you really think creating some video tutorials is going to be the best method for delivery? So hopefully that helped clarify a few things about the analysis phase. Now let's look at the design phase. So this phase deals with learning objects, assessments, instruction, exercises, content, lesson planning, and then really kind of the selecting of the different mediums that will be used to deliver the content. And so the design phase is really the most kind of detail-oriented parts of ADDIE. So the analysis phase, you've really thought through and analyzed kind of the entire situation. Now you're wanting to think more about what you're actually going to do. And so thinking a lot about putting into practice those goals that you've identified in the last phase. So in this one, so here are the steps from the design phase. Documentation of the project's instructional, visual, and technical design strategy. You'll want to apply instructional strategies according to the intended behavioral outcomes, create storyboards, design the user interface and user experience, prototype creation, and then apply visual design or graphic design. So let's unpack these a little bit more now. So thought about another way, the design phase determines all the goals, tools to be used to kind of gauge the performance, the various tests, subject matter analysis, planning, and resources. So in the design phase, the focus is on learning objects, content, all those things, lesson planning that I said before. The approach in this phase really needs to be kind of logical and orderly because you're trying to put everything in place. So as those storyboards, also think that you could be outlining exactly what you want to do in this phase. This is where the lesson plan or roadmap to what you're going to be creating is going to take place. Are there any questions about the analysis or the design phase before I move on to development? Just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about these two, because these two are really important. Don't see anybody typing, so hopefully that means we're all on the same page. I think the design phase can be one of the most fun, and this is the place that people often want to just kind of jump to because you know that you need to plan for what you're going to do, and so it's easy just to jump in to outlining or creating a storyboard for the training that you want to occur. But the analysis phase is really important because it helps you to identify what goals you have, who your audience is, so that you can therefore create learning opportunities that really meet the needs of your audience. Okay, so moving on to development. So the development phase, I think, is pretty straightforward. In the development phase, the librarians can create the content they designed during the design phase. So in the design phase, you outlined it, you created that roadmap for what you're going to do, and then then the next stage is that you develop it or you create everything that you just planned for. So if you said that you wanted handouts in the design phase, in the development stage, you actually create those handouts. If you plan to use a presentation, then the development stage, you'll actually develop the presentation. What is not as straightforward is that the data gathered in the analysis phase and the design phase needs to be referred to, and it needs to influence what is created in the development stage. For example, if in the analysis phase you realize that many of your attendees at an event speak English as their second language, then you'll want to consider having handouts in multiple language. Or if in the analysis stage you realize that your attendees at an event already have some working knowledge of the topic you'll be discussing, you want to make sure that you do not cover content unnecessarily. So you might want to just make sure everybody is kind of on the same page, but then not start maybe at the beginning. So for example, if you were giving a session on Microsoft Word, maybe you know that many of your attendees will already have a working knowledge of Microsoft Word because they've typed up documents for a long time, so you don't need to cover just kind of basic word processing things, but you need to start at maybe a little bit of a higher level. So we'll talk more about this when we put ADDIE into practice in upcoming examples. But nonetheless, I wanted to just kind of talk through a little bit about that now to help think through what you will need to use and create in the development stage and using the information that you determined in the analysis phase. Okay, so the implementation phase. So during the implementation phase, a procedure for training the facilitators and learners is developed. And so in this case, what I mean by the facilitators, it could be other librarians that are going to help with the trainings, or they may be leading some of the sessions themselves. Then everyone that's going to be working on this training needs to be on the same page about what's being taught. But if you're the only person who is going to be leading the sessions, then in the implementation stage, you'll really be working only with the library users. And so in the implementation stage, you will be working with course curriculum, those learning outcomes, the method of delivery, and then testing procedures. So if you haven't caught on yet, I really like information about ADDIE from the site educationaltechnology.net. But for the implementation stage, the site says, the implementation stage reflects the continuous modification of the program to make sure maximum efficiency and positive results are obtained. Here is where the instructional designer strives to redesign, update, and edit the course in order to ensure that it can be delivered effectively. Procedure is a key word here. So preparation for the learners, if you're the one doing all of the training yourself, includes delivering the content. And at this phase, you'll also want to make sure that you have all the material, resources, and everything that is needed for the training on hand. And then the last stage is evaluation. The evaluation stage really consists of two parts, and they are formative and summative. Formative assessment and summative assessment. If you have a background in education, you might be familiar with those terms. But if not, formative assessment is ongoing feedback of learning throughout the course. It's used by instructors to make adjustments to their teaching, and it's used by students to help them know what they need to focus on. So you can do so to get formative assessment, you could have some discussions if you were doing a group training session. You could ask some questions, maybe kind of get a feel for the room. A response system works really well here. So if you have something like Poll Everywhere, or maybe you wanted to use something like Plickers, you can kind of get a sense of where everybody is, if everybody's on the same page or not. And summative assessment is the evaluation at the end of a class or a training session that determines what the students or library users learned, and then what they know. And this could be the things they already knew before, but nonetheless, it's really at the end of the class, okay, what do the attendees know? Formative evaluation, it should be noted, is really present at each stage of the ADDIE process. So you should be kind of getting feedback from all those who you might be working with about how the process is going. I think it's always good to talk to other librarians, other library staff, to make sure that just to make sure that everybody understands or thinks that you're moving in the right direction while you're creating the training. And so really working with your team, I think, is a good way if you can. Not everybody has a team available to them within their library, but if you can get some feedback as you move through ADDIE, I think that is ideal. Any questions at this point about the different phases of ADDIE before we move on to looking at some specific examples? See someone typing, so I will give it just a minute. I think hopefully if you're a little bogged down in walking through each of the phases of ADDIE, it will make a little bit more sense when we look at these examples, just because I know that this can be very detailed. So we got a question: at what point do you like to reach out to other librarians for feedback on design or learning objectives? That's a great question. So I would really reach out probably at many different points throughout the process. Even as early as the analysis stage, I would reach out to other librarians, because I think it's always good to know, especially when you're thinking about who your audience is and maybe where they're at in terms of what they need to know and what they need to obtain from a particular session. we're all limited in what we know about our library users, and somebody else might have a different perspective, or they've had different conversations with library users that they could bring to the conversation and really kind of influence the direction of a particular training session. But certainly, as you're thinking about the design, as you're storyboarding or outlining, getting some feedback about the order in which you have planned everything to make sure that it builds well and really kind of has a good flow. That's a great point to get some feedback. Also, as in the development stage when you're creating the material, just to make sure that it's clear to somebody else. I always think that when I put something together, it makes sense, but I also know what I'm thinking, and I know what's in my head. Other people don't know what I'm thinking, and so something that makes sense to me might not make sense to somebody else. And so getting that type of feedback at that point, I think, is also really helpful. Good, thanks for asking that question. Okay, so now let's look at scenarios in the library when we can apply ADDIE. As I said earlier, even though ADDIE looks like it follows a linear pattern, you do not have to start with the analysis phase. You can jump in at another point depending on the project that you're working on. And so I'll give some examples of what that looks like coming up. Okay, so let's say you are planning and facilitating new employee orientations, which is an important part of developing the library culture and just something that we have to consider in all of our libraries. So as resources and services change with the introduction of new technology, community needs, and changing user demographics, orientations need to be regularly updated. Often, librarians are tasked with teaching their colleagues about new resources and services for which they're primarily responsible. So effective instruction is necessary for library staff to fully use and promote new resources and services. So using the ADDIE model can help us design new instructions for new hires so that the time spent on the orientation is effective and useful. Let's look at how ADDIE would look like for a new employee orientation. So for new employee orientations, you may want to reflect on any potential prior knowledge new hires may bring to the orientation that impacts where you start the training. So specifically in the analysis phase, instructors distinguish between what the new hires already know and what they should know after completing the orientation. In the design stage, the focus is on all the goals, tools, and tools used to gauge performance. So additionally, the focus is on learning objects and the content. So as the leader of a new employee orientation, you want to think about the resources. This could be people, the resources could be presentations, it could be videos, it could be documents, it could be HR paperwork that you need to have for the training. And so in this stage, focus on the content and make sure that you have the necessary content available and ready, and also think about the order in which you want to deliver that content. It's probably good to start with some sort of welcome and introduction to the library, but you also might not want to leave information about the organizational structure until the very end. So just be thinking about the order in which you want to share information. So again, in the development stage, instructors make use of the data collected from the two previous stages of analysis and design and use this information to really create the program. The implementation stage is where you're going to create and implement what you'll do during that new employee orientation. So deliver the orientation and take notes of what worked and what didn't. And this is a good time to kind of build in some of that formative feedback right there. For the evaluation stage, you'll want to consider how you will assess the success of your new employee orientation. Some learning outcomes will be easier to assess than others. So for example, it's fairly simple to determine if a new employee has learned how to check out a book. It's not as easy to determine if new hires can articulate their role within the library, because you want them to not only be able to verbalize it, but to act on it as well. Therefore, think about assessments of a new employee orientation, and you might want to think about them having multiple parts. That there can be an immediate assessment of what the new hire has learned, and then a follow-up assessment a couple weeks in to see how the new hire is adjusting. Most of you likely already have new employee orientations in your library, so maybe you want to revamp them, and instead of starting with the analysis phase, you actually would want to start with the evaluation stage of ADDIE, because you want to think about what's working well and what's not working well. However, maybe you have some new processes and procedures you need to add to the new employee orientation, so you don't have to start from scratch, but you do need to recreate the training. Therefore, you may want to start at the design phase and outline or storyboard everything to see how the new information fits into what was previously being shared. Then from the design phase, you can move to development and implementation. So genealogy. Many libraries provide resources and support for genealogy. Genealogy can easily be seen as a take and get or a very content-heavy topic, but in fact, it is another great opportunity to make learning more accessible for attendees by using the ADDIE model. So as always with ADDIE, think about your audience. Who are the individuals that want to learn about genealogy? Are there any common characteristics, or are there things you should keep in mind when designing training, such as what prior experience might they bring to the genealogy session? Then, also in the analysis phase, think about how you want to deliver the training. Are there any constraints you need to be aware of? Are you limited to a certain number of computers or software licenses? If so, you will need to cap attendance at a certain number. Once you have analyzed the genealogy session, think about how you want to set up the instruction. This is the time to create an outline or storyboard, whatever you prefer. The reason to create an outline or storyboard is to see how everything fits together. You'll want to consider the order of the content, and you'll want to make sure the skills build on each other. Once you have the genealogy session basically designed in either an outline form or with a storyboard, you can start developing the materials you will need for the session. This could include PowerPoint presentations, lecture notes, handouts, etc. So once you have developed the session, you'll implement your genealogy session. In this stage, you may want to train other library staff to give the training, or you'll deliver the content to your library users yourself. Lastly, you will evaluate the genealogy session. Remember that both formative and summative assessment are part of evaluation. Formative assessment should happen throughout the ADDIE process. So at this point, you want to focus on the summative assessment, perhaps. Check to see if the learners learned what you intended them to learn by having them complete a questionnaire, or talk to other library staff about how the session went. So even though I've gone through this discussion about genealogy sessions in the linear kind of ADDIE order, perhaps you also have a genealogy session that you give at your library. If this is the case, you aren't going to probably start with analysis, though you could. Instead, you might want to again start with evaluation. What is working and what is not working? Then when you know that, you can move from evaluation to analysis. So computer classes are another practical program provided by libraries where using the ADDIE model can make the training more effective. So for computer classes, you may also want to start at any point within the ADDIE framework. For this example, I'm going to go ahead and start with the analysis phase. Think about your attendees. Who are they? What do you know about them? What is your course setup? What is your room arrangement? What are any limitations that exist within the space? Is this course a standalone course, or is it in a sequence of courses? If it is part of a sequence of courses on different computer trainings, where does it fall? So those are all questions you would want to ask yourself in the analysis phase for a computer class. Then think about design. Determine the scope and content of what you will cover. What are the main topics that you need to cover in the computer class? Will there need to be other computer classes that are follow-up courses? Outline or create storyboards for the computer class. Then develop the material you will use. Will you give handouts? Will you use a presentation? Will you create lecture notes? Will you write scenarios that your attendees will need to follow and complete the tasks on the computer? Next, implement everything. Share your course with other library staff. Ask yourself if anyone else will help you teach. Make sure you are all on the same page about the course. Then teach the course. During the course, be aware of how things are going and what you might want to change for next time. Figure out a way to make notes of what went well and what can be improved, because I believe it's best to capture these during the course or immediately after the course so you don't forget. Finally, evaluate the computer course in its entirety. Did the attendees learn what you wanted them to learn? How do you know? I encourage you to think about conducting some sort of attendee assessment. This can be done with a few quick survey questions, or you could ask attendees to write down one thing they learned and one thing they would still like to know more about. So I have another example coming up, but before I move on to that one, are there any questions about new employee orientations, the genealogy session, or the computer class, and how ADDIE is applied to those? Oh, I do see one question. Do you have an app or method you like to use in capturing during course notes feedback? So I really enjoy like student response systems. If you can kind of capture kind of the feel for the room right then. Sometimes you do need either the attendees need to have their phone available to answer those types of questions. So if you don't want to assume that attendees are going to have a cell phone that allows them to kind of text in a response to a question, you can actually use something called clickers. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with it, but they're actually pieces of paper that you can turn for A, B, C, or D, and you can use your phone to scan the room, and people, if they think that the answer is A on something, they would turn their paper to where A is pointing at the top, and then you could get all of the data by scanning the room with your phone, or if you had an iPad, like a library checked iPad that could check out, you could have the Clicker app on there. So I think while it is it's a technology tool, it's more of a low-tech way, because the attendees or the students don't need to have technology in their hands in order to work. So that's one thing that I really like to do to kind of capture some data right away in my training sessions. And it can be simple questions where you say, okay, we just talked about, I'm going to use Microsoft Word for an example. We just talked about how you can insert a comment, let's say, and then you can ask them, what button they need to push on the ribbon to be able to get to those comments. And then you can ask everybody, you can give them 4 options, like edit or file or review or options, let's say, and then they have to pick the right one. And if it's C, they have to turn their piece of paper to C. And then it's all anonymous though, so you can get a sense of, is this something I need to reteach, or is this something that everybody understands and knows, and so I can move on? So hopefully that helps. But there are certainly other things you could do. There is a thing called like a minute paper, where you could just have attendees, write down one thing they learned in the session, one thing they'd still like to know, and then have them turn in those responses as they leave, or you could have them, maybe you fill out that paper halfway through the course to be able to kind of get a sense for how things are going. Any other questions? Thanks for asking that one. No? Okay. So even in makerspaces, when there might not be as much formal instruction, the ADDIE model can be useful for designing learning opportunities for library users. So when there is not a formal instruction time, but learning is still occurring in a space, it can be challenging to set up the learning in an intentional manner. ADDIE can be very useful for that as well. For this type of learning, you can still start at any point in the ADDIE framework, especially if you already have a makerspace set up. But again, I'm going to start with the analysis. Ask yourself, who are the users of your makerspace? What do you have in the makerspace? What will you need to create training for? Do you have space limitations? Do you have technology limitations? Thinking about the results of your analysis, think about what you need to cover in your orientation, or in however you want, or it could be orientation, and I mean to makerspace. Will these be handouts only for how to use the equipment? Will you decide to hold a formal class about the tools in the makerspace because in your analysis you realize the primary users will be individuals who have little experience with those types of tools? Or will handouts that you can have in the makerspace be sufficient because many of the users will be experienced or have some experience at using the tools available in that space? Or is there something else you need to design? Maybe you want to create some video tutorials that individuals can watch before they come and use the space. Once you've determined the scope and content, you can outline, storyboard the content. Then develop whatever it is that you decided to create. This could be handouts, it could be a presentation, it could be video tutorials, it could be video tutorials that someone could open up on their phone with a QR code and maybe watch someone do it in the makerspace right away. Just think through how you could create some training and instruction within the makerspace. Next, make sure all library staff working in the makerspace, and really maybe all library staff in general, know what instruction is being offered. Then specifically for the library staff working in the makerspace, ensure they all know how to use the equipment and can teach people about it. Then set up the training, give out the handouts, or offer formal training sessions. Then evaluate your instruction plan. Do you need to offer more or less formal training? Do you need to create more or less handouts? Do you need to include pictures in the handouts if you didn't before? Ask for feedback on the support offered for the makerspace from library users. Find out what is missing. Once you have done the evaluation, you can go back through ADDIE. Though you may be able to skip analysis and go straight to design or develop based on the feedback you received in the evaluations. If you start to see a new group of individuals using the makerspace, you may want to redo the analysis phase at some point. So that is the last example that I have of applying ADDIE for different library training sessions and different library settings. Are there any questions that I can answer? I hope you all found this helpful. Thinking through the ADDIE model and applying it to different library settings. For me personally, it's been a very useful model as I have tried to just implement more training and instruction in my library. It's just nice to kind of have a framework that I can walk through. Thank you, Jennifer. Sometimes creating training can be really overwhelming, and again, having that framework to kind of guide the process, even if I'm just redoing a training that already exists, can just to make sure that I'm really being thoughtful about the process and doing the best job I can. It's been really helpful.
I really enjoyed that overview of the method, Lauren. I'm working on developing an e-course, and I want to go back through now to kind of apply it to before I have to turn in all my materials. Because I noticed this morning I mentioned something in the syllabus that I then forgot to stick anywhere in the entire course.
That happens. We all do things like that. Thank you. I enjoyed sharing, and please let me know if there are any questions that come up. I'm always happy to answer questions, and I'll go ahead and just type my email address in the box in case anyone does want to follow up with questions later. I always enjoy working with people and talking about instruction, so please feel free to send me an email if any ideas or questions come up later. Thanks, Sally.
Hey, Lauren, can you read out your email address because the people who watch from the archive will not see the discussion box.
Absolutely. So my email address is LD as in Diane Hayes, Hays. So just again, LDHAYS at mnu.edu. And so that's M as in Mary, N as in Nancy, U as in umbrella.edu.
All right, everybody. Well, have a great day.
Thank you so much.